Welcome to Criminalist Behavior Podcast, the podcast that takes you deep into the heart of Louisiana's history and current most chilling true crime stories. I'll be guiding you through the darkness of these crimes and all those involved. Each week we dig deep into those forgotten crimes or those crimes currently happening with underlying legends that continue to haunt us. So lean in, listen, and get ready, because true crime is anything but ordinary. Stay with me as we unravel what happened in these mysteries. So today we're on episode number 31, and this is the murder and hijacking of Harry Ainsworth and Anita Hedgepeth, which you also may know as the Good Samaritan case. If this is your first time listening, hi, my name is Sarah Soudier, and I'm your host of Criminalist Behavior Podcast. I want to thank you for listening to the show, and I really hope you enjoy it. So, trigger warning, this episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. So, I'm going to just jump right on in. Again, bear with me. I'm still getting over this whole, sinus allergy issue I'm having. So, my throat is still a little scratchy, and, I'm still a little stuffy in the nose area. So, if I sound a little different, I sound off, that is why. But nonetheless, if you hear me clearing my throat, whatever, sniffles, I'm going to try to edit that out, but it's an event, that is why. So, this might be a little long case, but I believe everything has to come to light. So, Harry Michael Ainsworth was a carpenter and an artist, and he was also a member of the COP's 8 citizen organization for the police support in the 8th district. He died tragically on Wednesday, January 25th in the year 2012. He was a beloved husband, and his wife's name was Cheryl Connor. He was the father of Jennifer Ainsworth, Dagan, and Damien Ainsworth. He was the son of Yvonne King Ainsworth and Spencer Herbert Ainsworth. His brothers were Billy, Joe, Mocha, Spencer, Philip, and Billy. Mike Ainsworth heard a woman scream as he was waiting at the bus stop with his children. And as a member of the Citizens 8th Police District Association in the Algiers Point neighborhood, Mike Ainsworth naturally jumped to help his neighbor. When the woman tried to enter her car, a man was attempting to carjack her, pull her out by gunpoint. Mike ran over and jumped on the front of the hood to try to stop the crime, only to be shot by the gunman. The gunman eventually fled on foot immediately, but he left Mike stumbling a short distance away, suffering from that gunshot wound to his chest. Mike Ainsworth then collapsed in his neighbor's yard. Mike Ainsworth grew up in Algiers neighborhood, and like I said, he was the father of 3, well-known in his area. And according to Bill Ainsworth, which was Mike Ainsworth's brother, he stated he had his 2 boys with him, getting ready to put them on the school bus. And the 9 and 10-year-old boys, yes, that young at that time, they saw their father get shot by attempting to help out his neighbor from this gunman by jumping on the hood, and the then suspect shot him in his chest. They ran down and sat with their father until somebody showed up, and they were visibly shaken by the loss of their father, and they were with him whenever he passed away. And according to Akeem Jola, she lived in the area, and she stated, "I wouldn't expect nothing to happen. I don't know what we can do to stop the crime in our area." And the woman that was the target of the carjacking is working with police to create a composite sketch of that suspect. And she was not hurt in the incident, according to police. Now, she was shaken up, and I'm sure she was very shaken because this man literally stepped to help her and then ended up dying in front of his kids. So I'm sure she has that guilt of that on her as well. Survival's guilt. So moments later, before emergency help could arrive, Mike literally died. Students at the International School of Louisiana and Algiers Point would not be allowed on the playground because this was too close to the scene of the accident, and the school required ID at the time to enter. Nowadays, that's very common in the year 2024, but this in the year 2012, that wasn't so common that you needed an ID to enter a school. So New Orleans police arrested 17-year-old suspect in connection with the shooting of what they would famously now call the Good Samaritan, who died in front of his two kids while trying to stop a carjacking from happening. Several tips from the community led to the arrest of 17-year-old Kendall Harrison, and he was accused of shooting Harry Mike Ainsworth, who was 44 years old at the time. Now, Mike is what he went by. His real name was Harry Mike Ainsworth, but Mike is what he went by. And Mike was with his two sons, who were 9 and 11, at the bus stop, just waiting at the bus, and it was on January 25th. When he literally stepped in because he heard his neighbor scream and witnessed that a man was trying to carjack his neighbor and ran to help. The carjacker shot him through the windshield and shot him in the chest. So Mike Ainsworth staggered into his neighbor's yard, where he eventually collapsed and then later succumbed to his injuries. The boys ran to him and sat by his side until emergency responders arrived, but that would obviously be too late, as their father would be pronounced dead on scene. And on Tuesday, that's whenever police picked up Harrison, 17-year-old, like I said. He was attending school, so they picked him up. And y'all, just can you imagine this for a second? So this 17-year-old is attending school. What the hell are you doing trying to carjack this woman? What are you doing? Why you got a gun? Like, why you had to kill this dude? And then what about your normal life? You going to school, high school. These police showed up at your high school to arrest you for murder, for this damn carjacking. What the? Okay. Okay. So, authorities linked him to the case through DNA testing, and they charged him as an adult. Harry Ainsworth was a longtime volunteer with the NOPD's COPS 8 program, which provided assistance to officers of District 8. And the members of District 8 station sincerely appreciated Mike's efforts to fix the station up, as he volunteered in painting and repairing various things in the building. They said that he will definitely be missed. So Harrison, that suspect, was literally 6 months shy of his 18th birthday when he shot Mike Ainsworth through the windshield of a Saturn Ion that he was trying to steal. Mike Ainsworth was a 44-year-old handyman who had sprinted toward the robbery in progress while taking his boys to the bus stop on the morning of January 25th, 2012. Mike Ainsworth had him involved in community policing efforts in the neighborhood. And Bill Ainsworth, Mike's brother, stated, "We help people. It's what we do. I guess I'll be doing more of it by myself now." So people who lived near Mike Ainsworth said that they cannot believe that the shooting happened so close to home. And one of Mike Ainsworth's friends stated, "He's my best friend. One of my best friends." And that man's name was David Graham. He was just taking the kids to school, he stated. He walks the kids to the bus stop every morning and picks them up every afternoon. And he would leave work to pick them up. He loved his kids a lot. Wow. So great father, and this is just a total tragedy. So Mike Ainsworth's girlfriend, Cheryl Connor, she was 33 and was also the mother of the two boys. She woke up that Thursday morning and leaned over to Harry Mike Ainsworth empty leather jacket and slippers. The couple was together for 12 years. So apparently Cheryl Connor broke down crying in the fetal position, and somebody had to go stay with them. And they stated, one of the passbys stated, it's so hard right now being the backbone in the family. I break down every now and then, but so many people in this community are hurting. And that was from Cole. And they also stated that just to know that my nephews were leaning over their daddy and watched him die, it's just devastating. The fact that their father will never be around is starting to sink in for the two boys. And Cole also stated that the 11-year-old was really distraught, but the 9-year-old seemed to be just angry and holding it together, surprisingly, after witnessing something like that. And that morning, the 9-year-old was holding back his emotions and was angry until someone pulled out a photo album. And he just broke down crashing, just let it all out for about 45 minutes. Man, that just so tugged my heartstrings, y'all. So, Cole has been unable to find one of her brothers to tell him that Mike has passed. And they stated that Philip Patrick Ainsworth is that brother who was missing, and they just all recall that it was a rough time because they were just trying to find their other brother, Philip, who was known to have paranoid schizophrenia, and he disappeared every now and then, but they just couldn't find him. And according to Cole, she stated, "You wouldn't believe the response. The response is overwhelming. People from Canada and all over the world have been calling the bank. If you knew him, you would be crying. He always did things for people." So everyone, not just in the community, but like in Canada, y'all, Canada, and within the nation was sending money in this case because Mike was just that good of a person. And just being a very good neighbor, trying to help his neighbor out, and saved her life potentially, and saved her from getting hurt, only to have his life taken. So the Algiers Point community is a very secluded community, and everyone knows everyone, and he would always help someone and never ask for anything in return. And the whole community was just very somber. He didn't think about what he was doing. He just went and helped his neighbor. This series of events began when the man approached the woman motorist that was sitting in her car, knocked on the window, and asked for the time. As the woman turned to check the time, that's whenever the suspect pulled out a handgun and told the woman to get out of the car. And this is when Mike Ainsworth then jumped on the hood of the vehicle, and the carjacker shot him. Police released a sketch of the suspect and were offering a $5,000 reward to any anonymous tipsters who could help detectives find a black man in his 20s, between 5'6" and 5'8" in height, and weighing about 140 and 150 pounds. Yeah, that's a freaking vague description. Black man in his 20s, 5'6", 5'8". I mean, okay. Let me put this needle out the haystack. Anyways, the woman was unharmed, and a fund was at the Algiers branch of Whitney Bank was created to help the Ainsworth family. And like I said, people from Canada and all over the nation was sending money to help during this Good Samaritan case. And on June 14, 2012, Kendall Harrison was indicted for second-degree murder of Harry Mike Ainsworth, a crime which came to known to the public as the Good Samaritan case, which was the armed robbery of Miss Anita Hedgepeth. Following a 7-day jury trial on December 2nd, 2014, and concluded on December 8th, 2014, Kendall Harrison was convicted on both charges. And on March 4th, 2015, the trial court sentenced the defendant to life in prison with the possibility of parole, but only after 45 years on count 1 and to 45 years on count 2, sentences to run concurrently. Dr. Samantha Huber, which was a chief forensic pathologist for the city of New Orleans, was the one who autopsied Harry Mike Ainsworth's body. And she documented her findings in a well-written report. Dr. Huber concluded that the victim suffered a penetrating bullet wound to the left chest wall, that the bullet literally passed through the victim's spleen, stomach, liver, lungs, and his heart. Dr. Huber removed the bullet from the victim's body during the autopsy and turned it over to the ballistics lab. Dude. Can you imagine, like, all your freaking major organs just being hit by one damn bullet? Like, how? That's just an anomaly, y'all. Like, this makes me think it was a 22 bullet, but I mean, because 22 bullet, if you shoot, like, it just literally gets tossed around, and that seems like what happened in this case. But needless to say, Miss Anita Hedgepeth testified that she was living at the 500 block of Villette Street in Algiers Point in 2012. On the morning of January 25th, 2012, about 7 a.m., she walked to her car from her apartment and noticed a young man walking towards her. She also noticed that Mike Ainsworth was with his 2 children at the bus stop on the corner of Valette and Eliza Street. As Miss Hedgepeth sat in the driver's seat of her car, there was a tap on the driver's side window. She then rolled down her window slightly, and a man standing next to her vehicle asked her for the time. And she stated as she turned to answer him, that's the moment that the man pointed a gun at her head and demanded her car. Miss Hedgepeth pushed the gun aside and refused to exit her vehicle. And the assailant once again aimed a gun at her and repeatedly demanded for Miss Anita to give her car up. Miss Hedgepeth exited the car holding her purse, which the assailant then grabbed, and this is when a struggle was ensued. The next thing she remembered was the car door slamming and the defendant seated in the driver's seat. She screamed, and at that moment, the victim jumped onto the hood of her car, which was Harry Mike Ainsworth. This whenever Mike then jumped into her car. And the windshield was smashed with his feet and fist and yelled to the defendant to get out. So Harry Mike Ainsworth literally smashed the windshield with his feet and fist to get this suspect out of her car. And Miss Anita Hedgepeth stated she heard 3 shots. The victim told her to run and then said, "He shot me." The victim jumped from the car, ran across the street, and collapsed in Miss Hedgepeth's front yard. By the time she made her way to the victim, his 2 sons were kneeling down next to him, crying. Meanwhile, the defendant fled the area on foot. Neighbors called 911 and the police and EMS arrived. And then eventually Mike's wife arrived on the scene, and she collapsed at the sight of seeing her husband being shot on the side of the road with their kids over the body. The police questioned Mrs. Hedgepeth about the shooting, and she recalled that she recalled that the defendant wore khaki pants, a fleece hoodie, and a cap, and he had dark skin. At police headquarters, Ms. Hedgepeth gave a recorded statement and helped sketch artist develop a sketch of the shooter and gave her purse to the police. Mitch Hedgepeth viewed a photo lineup compiled by the detective, which was known as Tanisha Sykes, but she wasn't able to make identification of the suspect. The day after the shooting, officers obtained Ms. Hedgepeth's blouse that she was wearing at the time of the shooting. Ms. Hedgepeth identified her vehicle as a 2005 Saturn Ion and said that the only other person to drive her car was her nephew, and then only in her company. She had not had her car serviced or cleaned in a month preceding the shooting. Detective Tanisha Sykes, the lead detective in the case, stated that on January 25th, 2012, her supervisor notified her of a homicide that took place at the 500 block of Valette Street in Algiers. Detective Sykes arrived at the scene at about 8:25 a.m., at which time Mike was already dead. Detective Sykes identified the crime scene photos taken by the crime lab, and she stated that there were cigarette butts, a cigarette package, shell casings on the ground, and the interior of Mrs. Hedgepeth's vehicle, and Mike Hainsworth's hat. The evidence obtained from the scene was deposited into central evidence and the property room, and Mrs. Hedgepeth's vehicle was impounded at police headquarters to be processed. The victim's two young sons and Ms. Hedgepeth, independently of one another, directed drawings of sketches of the shooter. And one of the victim's sons made a very good composite of the defendant that was eventually released by the police to the media. Later on the morning of the shooting, the victim's sons underwent forensic interviews at the Children's Advocacy Center. While processing Mrs. Hedgepeth's vehicle, the crime lab personnel recovered 2 9mm Luger spent casings from the interior of the car, and they swabbed the interior and exterior areas for the presence of DNA. So it wasn't a 22, it was a 9mm, y'all. 9mm went through every damn major organ of this man's body. The day after the shooting, FBI, DEA, and ATF agents assisted in the investigation by distributing sketches of the suspect and helping interviewing witnesses. During the investigation, the defendant was developed as a suspect in an unrelated charge in Jefferson Parish. Detective Sykes obtained a buccal swab from him and sent that to LSP crime lab for analysis. And eventually the lab notified NOPD that a male DNA profile was developed from the swab taken from the steering wheel of Mrs. Hedgepeth's vehicle. And then it was from that information that Detective Sykes obtained the arrest warrant for the suspect for the murder of Harry Mike Ainsworth and armed robbery of Mrs. Hedgepeth, followed by the search warrants of the suspect's residence, which was on South Indigo Street and Heritage Lane. At the South Indigo Street residence, officers seized several pairs of khaki pants, a black sweatshirt with a gray hood, and a fitted cap, all of which matched the description of clothing that was provided by the witnesses worn by the shooter. And the suspect was arrested on February 28th, 2012, and transported to the police headquarters, where he was then interviewed by Detective Sykes and Daryl Duquette, and they recorded a statement. After the statement, Detective Sykes collected the white rosary and red and black plaid boxer underwear that the suspect was wearing because witnesses described the shooter as wearing those type of items. Detective Sykes also obtained the defendant's cell phone, which contained a picture of him wearing a black coat, khaki pants, black tennis shoes, and a white rosary. Mr. Brian Young, which was a middle school administrator, testified that he was the suspect's mentor and a friend of the family for about 9 years before this incident took place. Mr. Young also told the jury that he and the defendant's aunt, Miss Rose Mitchell, lived in Woodmere area of Jefferson Parish in 2012 and worked together to transport the suspect to school, which was John McDonough High School. The witness stated that he was working at Martin Braham Charter School in Algiers in January 2012. Mr. Young recalled that the defendant spent the night of January 23, 2012 at his Heritage Lane home in order for him to be brought to school the next morning. However, the following morning, which was Tuesday, January 24, 2012, instead of driving the defendant to school, Mr. Young drove the defendant to the defendant's aunt's house, Rosemary Harrison's residence in Woodmere subdivision. Mr. Young recalled that on January 25, 2012, the school where he was employed was on lockdown because it was near the scene of this incident. Mr. Young stated that he had a telephone conversation with the suspect on the day of the shooting, but he did not see the defendant again until the following week. Nyron Harrison, which is the suspect's cousin, lived in Harvey in January 2012. And Mr. Harrison's grandmother, uncle, aunt, and sister lived on Villette Street at that time. And on January 25, 2012, Mr. Harrison was doing repair work at his father's property at the 800 block of Villette Street when the suspect stopped and visited with him before 8 a.m. Mr. Harrison remembered that there were police cars in the neighborhood at that time because of an incident which occurred down the street. And while Mr. Harrison and the defendant were visiting, the defendant's aunt, Rosemary Harrison, arrived to drive the defendant to school. And at some point after the shooting, Mr. Harrison received a visit from Detective Sykes, who took and recorded a statement from him. So, in case y'all out there in limbo, after the suspect shot Mike Ainsworth and tried to steal this car, he went to his aunt's house where he was talking to them like it was a normal freaking day, waiting on them to bring him to school. So, during cross-examination, Mr. Harrison stated that he was threatened by Detective Sykes with being charged as an accessory if he did not testify about the defendant's involvement in the shooting. Miss Rosemary Harrison, which was the defendant's great aunt, testified that in January 2012, she was with the suspect, her daughter, and her daughter's children. They were all living on South Indigo Street in Algiers. Mrs. Harrison stated that she would bring her grandchildren to school in the morning between 7:20 and 7:45 a.m. And on the morning of January 25th, 2012, she was driving her kids to school, the grandkids. And this is when she received a call from the suspect asking for a ride. And after she dropped her grandchildren off at school, she drove to the 800 block of Villette Street and picked up the suspect about 7:50 a.m. Mr. Daniel Dooley, which was a forensic interviewer at the Child Advocacy Center in New Orleans, conducted a recorded interview. And the victim's older son was who he interviewed. And DC was Mike Ainsworth's older son, testified that the victim of the shooting was his father. DC was 13 years old at the time of the trial, and he said that he was 10 and his brother was 9 when their father was shot. In January 2012, the victim's son lived with their parents in Algiers Point. And on January 25th, 2012, the victim's sons and the victim, which, Mike Ainsworth, walked to the glass blowing shop on a corner near their home to wait for their bus. And that's when they heard a woman scream because she was being robbed. DC witnessed his father run to the woman's aid, jumped on her car, beating on her windshield, and yelling to the assailant to leave. DC stated that he heard a gunshot and watched his father run from the car to a house across the street and duck down. The shooter ran from the area, and the two boys ran to their father. A neighbor took the two boys into his house where they waited. Shortly thereafter, the two boys' mother and uncle arrived at the neighbor's house, and that's when the boys learned that their father was killed in the shooting. DC stated that he remembered the shooting as a black male wearing a black jacket. The two boys were then transported to the Children's Advocacy Center, where both were interviewed, and DC stated that he listened to a recording of his interview before the trial, but that he did not remember saying some of the things he heard on the tape. As we all know, I mean, I'm sure he was in complete and utter shock. I mean, damn. He literally just watched his father get murdered. So, Miss Robin Mayer testified that she lived in Algiers Point for 12 years, and at the time of this incident. So, she lived on Slidell Street, and her mother resided on the 500 block of Villette Street. Her daily routine was to bring her child to her mom's house on Villette Street and then return to her home 5 blocks away to get ready for work. And on the day of the shooting, Miss Mayer stated that she dropped her child off at her mother's house at 7:05 a.m. And as she was leaving, she saw what she thought was a couple arguing across the street from her mother's house. And it was seconds after that she stated that she heard Miss Hedgepeth screaming and then saw her struggling with the suspect who was standing next to her car. Mrs. Mayer stated that she ran towards the commotion. The suspect reached in and out of Mrs. Hedgepeth's vehicle while Mrs. Hedgepeth was seated in the car. Mrs. Mayer then stated that she saw the victim run from the corner of Eliza and Villette Streets to help Mrs. Hedgepeth. So she stated that she seen Harry Mike Ainsworth run towards Mrs. Hedgepeth to help her. And by that time, Hedgepeth had exited the vehicle and the suspect had entered it. She recalled that Mike jumped on the hood, hitting and kicking the windshield. That's whenever she stated a shot was fired. The victim, Mike Ainsworth, then jumped from the hood of the car, alerting Mrs. Mayer and Mrs. Hedgepeth that the suspect was armed and he had been shot. The victim then ran across the street, and this is where he collapsed on a lawn at a nearby house. Mrs. Mayer stated that she ran under some steps and watched a suspect who was wearing a gray hoodie run towards the river area. Mrs. Mayer went to the unconscious victim's aid, and she stated that she attempted to stop the bleeding at Mike Ainsworth's torso by applying pressure to the wound. Just then, she stated that that's whenever Mike's sons ran to him and attempted to speak to him. EMS personnel arrived, but despite their efforts, they could not revive Harry Mike Ainsworth. NOPD expert firearm examiner Mrs. Meredith Acosta, she examined the 4 unknown caliber copper jacket fragments, specimens 1, 2, 3, and 5, that were fired from a 9mm caliber handgun, and 2 fired casings, which was specimen 4, and 1 fired casing, specimen 6, and a bullet that was retrieved from the autopsy of Mike. And Mrs. Acosta stated that the casings were retrieved from the shooting scene, and that they were in fact fired from a 9mm semi-automatic weapon. And she stated that she did not examine a weapon that was related to the case. Corporal Kay Harrell testified that she was employed by NOPD Sheriff's Office as the supervisor of the records division in the intake and processing center. She stated that her duties involved updating all inmate files, keeping track of probation, parole, and releases of inmates. And through her computer, Corporal Harrell was able to access information related to the locations of inmates. And on July 30th, 2014, Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office asked her to determine the suspect and Joshua McReynolds' location histories. The booking date on the suspect's location records was February 28, 2012, and the defendant's record indicated that he was housed in the Templeman 5 A1C1 cell block of the New Orleans Parish Prison from May 27, 2012 to June 20, 2012. And Joshua McReynolds' location history reflected he was booked on June 15, 2011, and housed in the same cell with the suspect from the shooting on June 6, 2012 to June 12, 2012. So pretty much a week. And the suspect's cellmate, Josh, testified that he pled guilty to armed robbery on June 25, 2012, and that the suspect was incarcerated in the New Orleans Parish Prison, serving a 20-year sentence at the time of the trial in this case. During a portion of time in jail, Mr. McReynolds was in the same cell as the suspect who shot Harry Mike Ainsworth. And he stated that the defendant, who was related to Reynolds, stated that he shot a man while carjacking a woman. The defendant referred to the killing as the Good Samaritan murder. Mr. McReynolds recounted that the defendant questioned him about his knowledge of the forensic evidence, specifically about DNA. The defendant explained that he had wiped down the car, but may have dropped a cigarette butt at the scene. And when the cellmate, McReynolds, questioned the suspect who shot Harry what it felt like to kill a man, that's whenever he stated that the suspect replied, "It was just like shooting a bird with a BB gun." How cold is that, y'all? How cold is that? Jim Huey testified that he worked at the New Orleans Parish Sheriff's Department and was the custodian of records of inmate telephone calls. He stated that phone calls of the inmates are recorded on an internet-based system and stored in a secure database. He testified that when an inmate makes a call, the inmate must use a PIN/folder number that was issued to the inmate whenever they were booked. And one of his duties was to provide law enforcement agencies copies of all the telephone calls from inmates. And the inmate is then explained that as he makes a phone call, that he is issued a warning that the call will be monitored and recorded. And everything that was recorded was the name of the caller, time, duration, number called, etc. And pursuant to the state's request, Jim Huey said that he supplied the CD containing the recording of the 4 calls that the suspect made in the first week of March of 2012. In the calls, the defendant is heard conversing with his father and denying involvement in the shooting. In the other calls, the defendant's father cautions the defendant not to talk to anyone about this case. Additionally, the father warns the defendant that the numbers the police have on him are bad. So the father was trying to tell him that there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, and stated that it was like 1 in 77.3 million. So Jeremy Ballard testified that on the morning of January 25th, 2012, he arrived at his glass studio in Algiers Point at about 6:50 a.m. His shop was located at the corner of Valette and Eliza Streets, and at approximately 7 a.m. that day, he heard what he thought were 4 gunshots. He testified that he walked out of his shop to investigate, and that's whenever he saw 2 children running in the street. Mr. Ballard then recognized the children from the neighborhood because he had seen them with their father on previous mornings waiting at the bus stop. Jeremy Ballard ran towards the children as the suspect ran across Valette Street towards Eliza Street. And he testified that when the suspect tripped on the sidewalk, that's whenever he knows that he was wearing the red plaid boxers. Mr. Ballard followed the suspect in his car. And however, he actually lost sight of him momentarily and drove on Opelousas Street and walked to Test Street. Therefore, the pair then walked back to Valette Street, and that's whenever he lost them. He said that he followed the man, he called 911 and reported the situation and provided the description of the suspect's clothing: tan pants, dark brown leather jacket with the plaid boxer shorts. And when the police arrived at his shop, he accompanied them into the patrol car, retracing, the route that the suspect took. Mr. Ballard stated that he viewed the suspect from a vantage point of no more than 20 feet. However, he was unable to make an identification from the photo lineup that the police put in front of him. And Troy Dickerson, the NOPD expert crime scene and fingerprint analyst, testified that he was called to the shooting scene, and by the time he arrived, crime scene technicians had already begun photographing and processing the scene. He stated that they photographed and processed Ms. Hedgepeth's vehicle. He swabbed the vehicle's driver door, the handle, steering wheel, radio knob, gear shift, AC, and everything in the car. And he processed the vehicle for fingerprints and hair fibers. The swabs and samples taken during the process were then sealed, identified, and placed in central evidence and property for further processing and testing. Sergeant Jeff Rodrigue of the Homicide Division of Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office testified that in January and February of 2012, he was assigned to this case through the New Orleans FBI Violent Crime Task Force. And he assisted Detective Tanisha Sykes in obtaining the buccal swab from the suspect. Acadiana crime scene lab and forensic DNA analysis, Jeremy Dubois was the one who tested the swab samples that were obtained. And he also performed the DNA testing on Ms. Hedgepeth's blouse that was worn on the day of the shooting. And it was him who literally issued a report of his results on February 8, 2012, explaining that he referenced the DNA samples from Mrs. Hedgepeth and the defendant for comparison of DNA profiles, and the testing of the steering wheel revealed that the presence of DNA for both Ms. Hedgepeth and the suspect was noted. He also stated that based on statistical analysis, the probability the male DNA found on the steering wheel being deposited by anyone other than the suspect was 73.7 million within the African American population. Defense ordered the testimony of the defendant's father, which was Michael Willis, who informed the jury that the defendant had been missing a tooth since junior high school. He also denied that the suspect, aka his son, was the killer. And this is when the suspect stood and displayed his mouth for the jury. The defense offered this testimony to refute the testimony of the state's witnesses. The defendant was not missing any teeth on the day of the shooting. Detective Sykes was called by the defense and confirmed that she was the head detective in the case. The detective admitted failing to have witness who viewed a photographic lineup sign the back of the photos if no identification was made. However, she reiterated that she noted in her report the procedure employed in displaying the photo lineups and whether identification was made by the witness. So, in all of this mess, the suspect, was trying to make an appeal. And, excuse me, he based that on different merit errors, and none of them really held up. So I'm gonna go over those errors that was stated within the court case, and it's just crazy. It's just crazy that this actually took place. So the first assignment of error was, in the first assignments, the suspect complained that his convictions are based upon circumstantial evidence and that the state failed to exclude every reasonable hypothesis of innocence. The defendant does not deny that the crimes occurred, but only that the state failed to prove his identity as the shooter, noting that no one identified him in the photo lineup and that the police found no gun or other incriminating evidence when they searched his home. And they stated that the whole second-degree murder charge, which, in case you didn't know, was the killing of a human being where the offender has a specific intent to kill or inflict great bodily harm. And it defines specific criminal intent as the state of mind in which exists when the circumstances indicate that the offender actively desired and prescribed criminal consequences to follow his act or failure to act. And the definition of armed robbery is the taking of anything of value belonging to another from a person of another, or that is in the immediate control of another by use of force or intimidation while armed with a dangerous weapon, which is exactly what happened. He was armed with a gun. He pointed at Mrs. Mrs. Hedgepeth, and demanded her car, which is her property. So, when reviewing the sufficiency of evidence to support this particular conviction, they are controlled by the Jackson versus Virginia case. And under that standard, the court must determine that the evidence viewed in light was most favorable to the prosecution, and that it was sufficient enough to convince a jury the fact that all of the elements of the crime had been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And the defendant was stating that because it was circumstantial evidence that, the prosecution was trying to accuse him of and charge him with this case, that every fact had to be proved, and that the evidence that was in question did not literally prove that, and that couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And conflicting statements to the factual matters is question of weight of the evidence, but this literally rests solely with the tier of fact who may accept or reject all in whole or in part. And the defendant maintains his convictions are baseless because none of the state's witnesses who viewed the photo alignments were able to identify him. And Mrs. Hedgepeth testified she viewed her assailant for a few moments and added that he was armed, demanded she surrender the car, and ultimately struggled with the suspect as the suspect pulled her from her car and grabbed her purse. And she also stated that she was able to compile a sketch of her assailant and her clothing description of the perpetrator. And Mrs. Robin Mayer, who was a few houses away, also noted that the shooter wore a gray hoodie. So, all in all, pretty much, he was literally not with enough evidence to support his merit of error. So, it was thrown out. And additional proof of the state's case came from the DNA evidence that linked the suspect to the crime. So, from statistical analysis of the test results and the 73.7 million chance that it could be someone else, this is whenever the assignment was worth meritless based on the DNA evidence. So, assignment 2, the suspect argued that the trial court denied his challenges for cause to jurors. The defendant challenged those jurors on the ground that they could not be fair and impartial because their responses to questioning revealed that they would consider the defendant's failure to testify in determining guilt. And that was juror number 24 and 27. They were members of the second voir dire panel. And the Louisiana Constitution, Article 1, Section 17, guarantees a defendant the right to a full voir dire examination of prospective jurors and to challenge jurors accordingly. The number of challenges granted to a defendant in a trial is punishable necessarily by imprisonment at hard labor, as in this case. When a defendant uses all 12 of the challenges, an erroneous ruling by a trial court on a challenge for cause that results in depriving the defendant of a peremptory challenge constitutes substantial violation of their rights. But it's stated that a defendant may challenge a juror for the cause if the juror is not impartial. A juror will not accept the law as given to him by the court. So, voir dire is an examination of prospective jurors designed to discover basis for challenges for cause to secure information for an intelligent exercise. So, a trial judge was then matched with what he had to rule on challenges for the cause. And the such ruling is subject to be reversed only when a review of the entire voir dire reveals that the judge abused his discretion in the sentencing. And all in all, they literally stated that the reversal is appropriate only when it appears that the trial judge's exercise of the discretion had been arbitrary or unreasonable, resulting in prejudice of the person being accused. So pretty much they had the jurors go back and forth, like I said, juror 24 and 27, and 24 stated, let me tell you why this is not the case. The defendant, they asked if they wanted him to testify. You got to hear from him. He's not required to testify, but do you still believe if he's convicted, he's going to die in Angola? And the juror stated that she wanted to hear from him, even though the law says he would not have to testify. So the defense stated that, I want to make this clear. And then the juror stated, okay, if my life was on the line, I would do anything I had to. Testify, stand on my head, whatever. That's the only reason, because I think it's worth it to him. I think I would feel more towards his innocence if he was willing to defend his own claim. And the defense argued that even though the law states that he doesn't exactly have to defend himself, he asked this juror if she still wanted to hear from him. And the juror stated that, I'm saying I would like to hear from him. I'm not saying I have to hear from him. I know what the law says. You're telling me from what the law says, you just asked for an opinion, and I said I would like to hear from him. Defense also interviewed the other juror, and that juror stated that part of her answer is what I felt if I ever did something, I would want to say my piece. I understand it's the law. I don't know how to separate it from something in the back of my mind saying, why wouldn't he want to speak up? Why wouldn't he want to speak on his behalf? I know it's the law and I understand that, but just to have him tell his version of the story is what they wanted to happen. But the defense argued so all you would basically be impressed by a defendant who comes up and takes a stand in their own defense. And the jurors both stated that because he feels that he's innocent, he should be able to state that he's innocent. And if they heard it from him, that it would go a lot in direction in oppressing them, pretty much. Impress seems a little frivolous, but it weighed a lot on them. So the defense stated that the state had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Just because the defendant comes up to you, he's stating that you would be impressed. So basically the defendant is arguing with two of the jurors, and this is the motion of error, but eventually it seemed that it was proved meritless. So this motion of error in his appeal did not hold to light. So overall, the responses during that, they could follow the law and be impartial, and the defendant's challenges, the assignment had no merit, so it was thrown out. The defendant also argued that the trial judge abused his discretion by failing to grant the motion for a mistrial based on the defendant's argument that the state was guilty of shifting the burden of proof. And this was assignment of error number 3 in his appeal. He said that the burden shifting occurred during the state's redirect questioning of Jeremy Dubois, its DNA expert, who testified that when the lab finishes its testing, it keeps a portion of the DNA extract for further testing in case there is an appeal and a third-party testing is sought. The defense objected that the mentioning of an appeal, and the judge sustained that objection. Then when the judge allowed the witness to respond that one half of the extract was reserved in the case, defense sought independent testing, the defense objected and accused the witness of shifting the burden of proof. The judge overruled the objection, and the defense requested a mistrial, which was denied. The trial court therefore refused defense counsel's request for curvature and structure. A mistrial, except for instances in a mandatory mistrial, are applicable and should only be used when substantial prejudice to the defendant was shown. So they have to determine whether prejudice actually occurred during the judge's ruling and whether a mistrial would be warranted. But with all of everything and the evidence and all this, literally, they proved that the merit was not granted. So the trial conducted a Miller hearing on July 8, 2015. And on September 18, 2015, this is when the suspect was sentenced to mandatory life in prison at hard labor with the possibility of parole after serving 45 years. And a conviction for second degree murder mandates a sentence of life in prison at hard labor without the benefit of parole, probation, suspension of sentence. But in the 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, the sentencing scheme that mandated life imprisonment without parole for those offenders under the age of 18 committed a homicide violated the 8th Amendment, which was cruel and unusual punishment. So basically, because he was 17 at the time, which was literally 6 months before he turned 18, at the time the crime was committed, they were stating that they could not do the whole life imprisonment because he was a minor at the time this happened. In response, they stated that in any case where an offender is to be sentenced to life in prison for a conviction of first-degree murder or second-degree murder where the offender was under the age of 18 at the time of the offense, they had to determine whether the sentence shall be imposed with or without parole of eligibility. And it was stated that in August of 2017 that there was an amendment to this ruling. And it stated that if an offender was indicted prior to August 1st, 2017, the crime of second-degree murder, where the offender was under the age of 18 at the time, commission of the offense and hearing was held pursuant to that article and shall apply. But if the court determined that the hearing was held prior, so this case happened in 2012, so this was prior. So prior to the sentencing on second-degree murder, the trial judge addressed the defendant. And they told the defendant, after they conducted it, the court heard the testimony from both the victim's family, and it showed that you have forever affected the life of that family. The judge told the suspect, "You brutally and callously took the life of Mike Ainsworth. When you did that, you took a husband from his wife, you took a son from his mother, you took a father from his son, and you took a friend and a worthy asset of Algiers. Yet despite the moving testimony of all the people that were affected, you sat on this witness stand and did not display a single remorse for the heinous and senseless killing for which you were convicted. By your hateful and sick action, you have instilled fear in both the victim's family and this entire community. No grandmother raising her child ever envisions the child growing up to be a criminal defendant, much less a convicted murderer. So make no mistake, you have forever damaged the psyche of both the victim's family and your own family. Indeed, you have visited an eternal plague upon both of these instances. Your violent and criminal actions, not only in this case, but one in which you attempted to commit an armed robbery, does not escape this judge's conscience or attention. And balancing this with the youth and lack of parental guidance as a child, the court finds that serving 45 years flat hard time before being eligible for parole serves the interests of justice. And in this case, the district court possessed the authority to sentence the defendant to life in prison without parole, but instead elected to restrict the parole eligibility for a fixed number of years. While that suspect restriction on parole eligibility on the life sentence was unauthorized by law, it was resolved in his armed robbery sentence. The court had already imposed a sentence that include defendant will not be released before he serves the 45 years in state custody. And only then might the defendant be released before serving the 45 years. So, given the 45-year parole ineligible sentence on the armed robbery count will give the effect to the court's intent that the defendant not be released earlier, and it remains to the district court for another Miller hearing, at which time the court would have the opportunity to impose a harsher term, which would be life in prison without parole. And the state argued that the defendant's appeal is untimely because his convictions for the second-degree murder and armed robbery with a firearm became final on November 4, 2015, which was the day he was sentenced. And they stated that an appeal must be made no later than 30 days after the rendition of the judgment from the ruling, and the state points out that the defendant exceeded that time of limitation whenever he filed his appeal. And because of that, the motion for appeal was not filed until March 1st of 2016, which is 118 days after he was convicted. So there was no indication of record that the defendant ever intended to waive his constitutional protected rights to appeal his convictions and sentences, and he would be entitled to an out-of-time appeal. So, obviously, they considered the untimely filed motion for appeal as a timely filed application for post-conviction relief, and they denied the state's motion to dismiss the appeal. So, I know that was a whole lot of shit I threw at you, but in conclusion, based on the record before the court, they found that defendant's convictions are affirmed. And what that means is the state's motion to dismiss the appeal was denied. The defendant's sentence for armed robbery with a firearm is vacated, and the resentencing or clarification as to whether the sentence included enhancements provision were prescribed. And the trial court further ordered that the resentencing on the second-degree murder conviction was part of the provisions of LACCRP Art 878.1. So the conviction was affirmed, sentence vacated in part, and remanded for the whole resentencing process. So this means that the jury convicted 20-year-old Harvey Mann early Tuesday morning at the high-profile murder, the Good Samaritan case, Harry Mike Ainsworth, at this hearing. The jury deliberated for more than 6 hours before they found Kendall Harrison guilty as charged of second-degree murder and armed robbery with a firearm, which obviously became known as the Good Samaritan case. So Kendall Harrison was sentenced. The verdict came in at 3:10 a.m., ending a criminal district court trial that ran until the 8th day. The drawn-out trial was marked by different exchanges from prosecutors and the DA and the defense attorney. So Kendall Harrison's defense attorney was Lionel Lon Burns, and he was a former prosecutor who ran a brief campaign to unseat the district attorney Leo Canizaro. But in the closing argument, defense attorney Burns stated that a police investigation led by a homicide detective was heading up for her first case as lead investigator. Burns told a jury of 6 men and women that the police planted the DNA for Kendall Harrison, and that was based on the cause of them holding it. So they stating that the evidence was planted, and this was just becoming a political tactic because he was trying to take the district attorney at the time's job in running for public office. So the central evidence in the case was no clear eyewitness identification during the photo lineup. There was no murder weapon, and there was no confession from Kendall Harrison, the suspect. And an expert testified that the material swapped from the steering wheel of Ms. Hedgepeth's car and the carjacking, attempted shooting turned up a trace DNA match to Harrison. And they really highlighted that it was just a trace. The defense attorney Burns suggested that police failed to solve a murder case that shook the city, and they took a shortcut. That's a new word. Awesome. But no, they took a shortcut to charge Kendall Harrison with the crime because tips were given to the sheriff's office. And the defense stated that they contend that the DNA of Kendall Harrison was placed in this case to just charge someone with the murder. And he literally raised the questions: was it added to the car? Were there swabs tampered with? I mean, he was basically trying to prove a reason of doubt. And he was going against Detective Sykes that she failed to adhere to the NOPD policy to get 2 witnesses to sign the photo lineups, in which they fingered a filler photo, failing to identify Kendall Harrison. And he basically was arguing that that's the problem in this case. Nobody can make, a a match to match Kendall Harrison to the crime in the photo lineup. And being the detective that supposedly she is on that case, she was going to make something happen so she wouldn't look bad. And the assistant DA attorney, Paya Patel, fired back at the defense, calling the theory disingenuous, cheap, and dirty, and stated that the DNA swab from the steering wheel was logged into the state police lab in Baton Rouge well before the police came calling for Harrison's DNA on February 6, 2013, which was 12 days after the brutal murder. And at one point during the deliberations, the jury asked to view the DNA packages sent to the lab. And Kendall Harrison did not testify on his behalf in this case. And among the witnesses was a convicted armed robber, Josh McReynolds, which was, Kendall Harrison's cellmate, who testified that he was housed with the suspect, Kendall, and how he admitted to killing Mike Ainsworth during a failed carjacking attempt. So, as you recall, whenever that cellmate was interviewed, he stated that whenever he asked Kendall Harrison, the suspect who killed Mike Ainsworth, what it was like to kill a guy, he stated that he didn't want to kill the guy, he just got in his way and he was scared. And whenever he asked him how it felt, he stated that it was similar to shooting a bird with a BB gun. So he had no remorse for his actions. And the assistant district attorney, Patel, and fellow prosecutor Alex Kalinda laid out an array of evidence, including testimony from a cousin and aunt of Kendall Harrison, which was the suspect who placed him 3 blocks from the crime scene within a half an hour of the killing at the 500 block of Villette Street. And Kendall Harrison told detectives he was in Harvey at the time and had been in Algiers Point for more than a week before Harry Ainsworth was shot in the chest. And they stated that early in the trial, Burns portrayed Mike Ainsworth as being overzealous and vigilante, which highlighted a toxicology report that showed he tested positive for marijuana. So they pretty much is trying to make the victim look bad in this case. And early in the trial, they described that Burns' defense was nothing but whooping and hollering. She literally had 3 hours of a closing argument. And apparently this is what was stated. I think you've seen their desperation and last-minute grasping of their last hope. What do you do in defense of irrefutable evidence? The defense team has decided to attack the Ainsworth family, and they're grasping at straws. So that's what the prosecutor was stating in their closing argument. And they also cited testimony about the transport of the DNA evidence from the state lab, and for the jurors to believe that the head detective Sykes planted DNA evidence, you also had to believe in time travel. Like, what? So, Kendall Harrison's father took the stand to vouch for his son, stating that he was 17 when Harry Mike Ainsworth was killed, and his son never owned a gun. And that to open the door for prosecutors to show that the jury, a photo taken at the Harrison cell phone showed him carrying a gun. So the prosecutor proved his father was lying on that damn stand because there was a photo taken of his son holding a freaking gun on the cell phone. So they rebuffed the suggestion that Mike Ainsworth was the cause of his own death. They said that Mike Ainsworth was a hero and gave his life to protect a person that he didn't really even know, but was his neighbor. And Kendall Harrison was arrested, and he faces a life in prison. And then until 3 years ago, a mandatory life sentence would have been what he would have been convicted of, and a mandate that was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court 5 months after the shooting forced Louisiana judges to consider sparing those that were not 18 or older, those youthful offenders, life in prison without the possibility of parole. So basically, they stated that he's going to have a chance for parole because of his age at the time this took place. That's all that boils down to. So they spared 21-year-old Kendall Harrison a guaranteed life in prison sentence, granting him the chance of having parole after he served 45 years. And the court majority reasoned that the appropriate occasions for sentencing juveniles to this harshest possible penalty will be, pretty uncommon. And they required a hearing, which Kendall Harrison took the witness stand and fielded direct questions from the loved ones of Harry Mike Ainsworth. And he stated that he was falsely convicted. And the judge ordered a report from the state parole officials who recommended life without parole. And the judge decided differently. So this is what the final thing of the judge was. Statement. You brutally and callously took the life of Harry Mike Ainsworth. When you did that, you took a husband from his wife. You took a son from his mother. You took a father from his son. You took a friend and a worthy asset of the Algiers community. You sat on the witness stand and did not display a single type of remorse for the heinous and senseless killing for which you were convicted. By your hateful actions, you have instilled fear in both the Ainsworth family and the entire community. Referring to both Ainsworth and the Harrison's family, you have visited an internal plague on both of these homes. Christopher Bowman, which was a spokesman for the DA office, said that it was just the second time the Supreme Court ruling handed out eligible juvenile a convict less than mandatory life. And retired Judge Johnson did the same thing for Stephen Williams, who was convicted of a murder in 2013. So basically, they had to grant them possibility of parole. They couldn't be sentenced to life without it. So, y'all, after the sentencing, Mrs. Hedgepeth, the one that was being carjacked, said she was relieved and satisfied with the 45-year minimum sentence for Kendall Harrison, and she would pretty much prefer that he will literally stay behind bars forever. And this is what was stated. I feel it's just, she said of the sentence. I'm glad it's over. And attorney Lion Burns, who represented Kendall Harrison, stated that they had mercy on him. Everything else is stacked against him. It provides the guy with some hope and, being able to be granted parole after serving a certain amount of time. So, yeah, the Good Samaritan case. I am curious to know what you think. Like, would you take a bullet for your neighbor? I mean, I know at the time he thought that the suspect was unarmed, but I mean, seriously though, would you take a bullet for your neighbor? Are you close to your neighbor? I know I am not close with my neighbors. Hell, I can't even tell you their names. Like, everybody nowadays is just secluded and keeps to themselves. But I could assure you I would try to help if possible, at least call, 911 or something. But like, to jump on the hood, bang on that windshield, demand that the suspect get out the car, like, senseless, very senseless. And he was just doing what he felt he could do at that time. So I'm interested to hear what you think of this case, and how you would react if you seen your neighbor being carjacked and screaming and all this good stuff. Like, I would literally go to console her and help her, take down the license plate, whatever I could do to help. But I mean, I'm also known to be able to, get in the middle of somebody arguing. I'm stupid. I'll be the next person you probably read about in the Good Samaritan case. But at the same time, like, I'm that's just the type of person I am. If I see somebody's in trouble, I'm going to do what I can to help. So I think I could place myself where Harry Mike Ainsworth was that morning when he was waiting at the bus stop. He was just trying to help, save this woman. And then, all this is happening in front of his children. And I know he did not think that he was going to be shot in front of his kids and die that morning whenever he took that senseless act to follow his neighbor. So, also, again, just your friendly reminder, go vote for the Women's Podcasting Award, as I am a nominee. Again, it's under documentary category, under Criminalist Behavior, Louisiana True Crime Podcast. I will directly put those links into the show notes, as well as the sources that I retrieved all this information. If you have any more information in this case, whatever your opinions are, just reach out to us. I'm all for it. Again, we do have a Patreon page. We also have a website. All of this access could be on there. It's going to be linked in the show notes, so you can find that on any of your local podcast apps, wherever you're listening to this at. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us. Hit like, follow, subscribe, share, whatever. Get our name out there, y'all. Again, we're on Apple. We're on pretty much every podcast app that you can think of. YouTube. We also on social media. All of your social media, TikTok, except Snapchat, because it's just weird. But we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Insta, Tumblr, whatever. Anyways, be sure to come back next week. And until then, this is your host, Sarah Studier. And don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, and share Criminalist Behavior, a Louisiana True Crime Podcast. Thank y'all, and y'all enjoy y'all day. Bye.